Hello everyone, my name is Emily Hunt. For my Capstone research project, I wanted to investigate if the incorporation of novels into 6th grade reading instruction would have an effect on student engagement and student motivation. As a middle school reading teacher, one of the greatest challenges that I faced within my career is motivating students to read. At this point in their lives, students are viewing reading as a task and they see it as boring. The true value of enjoyment doesn't seem to be there. Educational stakeholders have been researching to find ways in which students are motivated to read. Wickfield and Guthrie hit the basis of this when discussing that in order to talk about student motivation, you first have to talk about the amount and the breadth of reading that is offered. So for instance, are students offered a large amount of text to choose from or very little? Taking this foundational knowledge, I decided that the overall purpose of this project was to determine if the incorporation of novels into 6th grade reading instruction would increase student motivation and also student engagement. So through a mixed methods approach, what I ended up discovering was students are more motivated to read, for one, if the text that they're reading interests them, and surprisingly enough, group dynamics and gender also seem to play a role in student motivation. When thinking of implications for future research, I would like to see if there's a correlation between parental involvement and student reading motivation. In addition to this, if students are reading texts that interest them, they are indeed more motivated to read. So I would like to see more research into converting what we use in schools to texts that are more interesting and more appealing to students. It has been determined through research that there are 3 high factors that contribute to student motivation. The first factor being intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is occurring on the inside. You want to do it. You enjoy it. You're not seeking a reward out of what you're doing. Now, the opposite of that is extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation would look something like this. I'm given a reading assignment in my reading class, and I read, and then once I'm finished, I'm given a snack or a prize or a gift. So for extrinsic motivation, you're doing what's expected of you with the hopes of receiving a reward for it. And then regulatory reading. So regulatory reading is how often are we reading. Now, it has also been determined from previous studies that student motivation in reading is a huge predictor in reading comprehension. So if students are, again, interested in what they're reading, they'll have a long-term intrinsic motivation, so that drive to want to read, and in return increase their reading motivation. So for me, I've considered all these factors into each of my participants, and by thinking first what students are interested in, this is a stepping stone to reading motivation research. The technologies that were used in this project were Microsoft Excel and Microsoft PowerPoint. Microsoft Excel was used to analyze all quantitative data. Now, for the participants in this study, each participant was assigned a unique letter, such as student A, student B, student C, that's not in any way linked to their name. So, for this reason, this maintains confidentiality for all students because their letter can no way be linked back to them. Now, all data that was collected was placed in a filing cabinet that was locked. Also, the classroom was locked, so all of this data has been double locked. Now, with this in mind, all data that was collected has been shredded to maintain student confidentiality. Participants for this study were 12 6th grade students ranging in age from 11 to 12. These participants exhibited a score that was 5 points lower than grade level benchmark on the measures of annual progress, which is the MAP assessment. In addition to this, the study was taking place in a study skills course, and the study skills course is in conjunction with the regular reading class. So this is considered the student's elective time. In addition to this, the school that the study was completed in has shown a rapid decline in students' reading for interest. As you can see from the chart below, this is grade level usage of Accelerated Reader. And as you may note, from kindergarten, first, second, and even third grade, a higher percentage of students are using Accelerated Reader, meaning they're reading for interest. But what's disturbing is if you note from the 5th grade to the 6th grade, there is a significant decrease, noting that 5th grade is almost at an 80% percentage of usage for Accelerated Reader, and 6th grade is barely over 20%. So obviously, something is happening between 5th and 6th grade that are causing students to lose interest in reading. In addition to this, there's another drop between 6th and 7th grade. Now, the school in which this study was conducted is actually a K-8 school, and you may notice that 8th grade is nowhere on the data. This is because the administration and also the librarian in our school felt that 8th grade would not participate in Accelerated Reader with the rapid decline of reading interest in middle school. This study was conducted with a mixed methods approach. Now, you may notice the flow chart here on the left-hand side of the research methods column. This is a consecutive flow of all of the assessment instruments that were used. So first, a reading interest survey was administered to students. So what I figured from my professional background is that students are more motivated to read if they're interested. So the reading interest survey asked students to reflect on the types of genres they enjoyed reading and locations they liked to read. From that interest survey, I was able to create 4 categories of interest for the entire class. First being young adult fiction. So students were mentioning texts like text similar to Diary of Wimpy Kid, text similar to Wonder by R.J. Palacio, text similar to Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. So we had young adult fiction, realistic fiction, adventure, and mystery texts. So from there, I conducted a great deal of research to determine what type of adolescent novels would fit into each of these categories. I also consulted with a veteran teacher for advice there as well. Following this, students were administered a motivations of reading questionnaire. This questionnaire was created by Wigfield and Guthrie, and within this motivation questionnaire, it asked students to reflect on the ideas of if they felt that they were a good reader, or if they found reading instruction to be important, or if reading was fostered at home. Finally, students were grouped into collaborative groups based on their reading interests. So students ranked the top 5 texts of their choice after they completed what was called a book tasting. So the books that were collected for the 4 genres mentioned prior, students had the opportunity to look at each of the books and touch each of the books and read the summaries and flip through the pages. From there, they ranked their top 5 books of interest. So after analyzing that, students were grouped according to books of their interests. Then they conducted a literature circle setting. So how this occurred is students were grouped, and through the 50-minute class periods, they were monitored by on and off task, and I had a monitoring sheet for that. So at 5-minute intervals, each student was observed to determine if they were on task or if they were off task. So from the results, you may notice that the blue bars represent the amount of time a student was on task. The red portion represents the amount of time a student was off task. So I'd like to look specifically at 2 students that seem to exhibit a greater time off task, looking at student C and student I. So these 2 students were in the same collaborative group. Also, these students were male. When looking at the triangulation between the motivations for reading questionnaire, it was determined that both of these students felt that they were not good readers. In addition to this, both students did not view reading as important, or being a strong reader as something that was important to them. And something else that I found to be very interesting is that both of these students responded that reading was not fostered at home. So parents and guardians were not encouraging them to read at home, and also they weren't encouraging them to look at their reading grade and to place an emphasis on reading. In addition to this, looking at students D, students E, and students G. Students D, E, and G were on task majority of the time, which I found to be quite interesting. When looking at the motivations for reading questionnaire, there was some triangulation between the amount of time they were on task. These students saw the value in being a strong reader and thought it was important to be a strong reader. And something that I found to be quite interesting is they felt that it was important to read, even if you weren't asked to. So these students have already exhibit some intrinsic motivation towards reading, while students C and students I are having a negative attitude towards reading. The three results that I gathered that contributed to student motivation were student reading interest, gender, and also the group dynamics. When considering student reading interests, from my professional background, Wickfield and Guthrie had already discovered that student interest is a huge factor in which motivates them to read, and this held true within my study as well. The students who were interested in the novels that we were reading exhibited more time on task than off task. Looking at the gender of students, it has been determined that there is a gap between male and female achievement in reading. It's been determined that we should foster reading for males like we attempt to foster science for females. And so it was interesting because the male students were off task a greater amount of time than the female students, and this could contribute back to interest and also to the group dynamics. So it has also been determined that if members of a group are paired with different dispositions, then that's going to result in some conflict and some disagreements. In addition to this, if group members are not held accountable for their work, this can be a factor that faces off-task time. So student grouping was definitely a factor here in my on-task and off-task behavior. So for my group that was on task, the majority of the time, they worked really well together. They had the same dispositions and were thinking about the same things. However, the groups that were off task were not holding one another accountable for what they were supposed to be doing. So from here, grouping has a huge factor on student motivation. The conclusion of this study is that students are more motivated to read if the material they are reading interests them. So what I'd like to see some future research on is switching from prescribed reading programs to texts such as novels that are more interesting to students. The second conclusion that I've drawn is that male students are not as encouraged to read as female students. What I can see from this is I would like to do some more future research on specific strategies to motivate male students and finding those interests within male students to foster reading for them. And thirdly, student grouping appears to be a huge factor affecting student motivation. I think the future research for myself needs to be conducted on appropriate grouping of students and also researching accountability. What are some strategies that we can use to hold students accountable in grouping? And I'd also like to see if that type of grouping would have an effect on student motivation, a positive effect. Finally, I would like to do some additional research to see if parental involvement has an effect on reading motivation, because our students that we observed, students C and I more specifically, made statements that reading was not fostered at home. So does parental reading at home also have a factor on student motivation? So those are a few things that I would like to conduct some future research on and see if I can find some data that I can apply to my classroom. The educators, our greatest joy is seeing when students enjoy what they're doing and see value in it. From this study, I've determined that student interest, gender, and group dynamics are large factors contributing to student motivations in reading. Lifelong reading is so important. Reading extends far beyond our classroom walls to college and to life. What I would like to do is to take this data and present it to administrators to show that when students are interested, they are more likely to read. Incorporating novels into instruction, incorporating articles that are so important to students, I feel that we would see an overarching growth in MAP assessments and K-Prep assessments. It is our role to find the factors that motivate all students to read. This was just a few, and I know that there's more. So as educators, It is our ultimate goal to create a lifelong love for reading within all of our students.